Go back with me to high school chemistry class for a minute. You probably learned at some point the chemical formula for water is H2O, right? 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen atom. That is essential for life. Water is what keeps us alive. Our bodies are made mostly of water and we need it. The whole planet needs it in order to survive. Funny though, you add 1 extra oxygen molecule into that mix, you end up with H2O2, and instead of having water that sustains life and gives us life, you end up with hydrogen peroxide, which may be useful, but is poisonous to drink and will kill you. Adding something to what is essential, pure, clean, and life-giving has a way of being death-dealing. It turns out that's also Paul's claim about adding things to the gospel. And that's where we're headed in this conversation on Freed for Love, looking at the letter of Galatians. Last time we introduced the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Galatians, and at the heart of it, we said in the opening 10 verses, not only did Paul go through the standard introduction of who I am and who I'm writing to, but he really quickly cut to the chase and said to the congregations in Galatia, if anybody tries to sell you on something other than the gospel you already received, if somebody tries to add something or spin something or give you, say, H2O with an extra oxygen in it, don't you fall for it, adding something to the pure, clean water that is the gospel, the free gift of God's good news in Jesus. Once you start adding stuff to it, it's not just a little bit dirty or a little bit tainted, it's downright poisonous. Paul uses strong terms to say that the people in Galatia seem to have abandoned and let go of the good news that he brought to them. And as the letter goes on, we're going to unpack what exactly is the difference between what Paul had told these Christians in Galatia and what other people had come along and said. But for Paul, the contrast is sharp. It's all or nothing. It's either God's free gift of grace, apart from what you do, what rituals you follow, where you come from, what your ethnic background is, any of those things. It's all got to be God's free gift that at most we receive as a gift by faith, or you've turned water into hydrogen peroxide, and you've turned something that's life-giving into something that's death-dealing. Those are the stakes as Paul lays it out. And then as we move into verses 11 through the end of chapter 1, that would bring us to about the 24th verse of Galatians, Paul moves from this sort of introductory salvo to talk about his own life story. And you probably have some sense already about the broad contours of Paul's life. That's one of those stories that many of us grew up hearing in Sunday school lessons, maybe even played out in a flannel board. It's one of those scenes that's famous even in paintings throughout art history. And the gist of it goes like this. Saul of Tarsus grew up in Judaism, grew up then taught under well-known Pharisee leaders, so grew up probably being taught under the teachings of a rabbi in and around Jerusalem or Judea, and was fiercely zealous for the traditions of Judaism and for the particular way of being Jewish that the Pharisee party was connected with. And that had to do with sort of this going above and beyond what the commandments required so that one's whole life was lived and measured out by faithfulness to God's commands, going above and beyond to show a whole life dedication to God. And Paul had bought into that completely. Probably, side note, he had gone by both Saul and Paul as interchangeable sort of names. Saul being the Hebrew name that sort of honored his Israelite tradition, and Paul being a Greek or Roman name. So like a lot of people who, say, immigrate to the United States and carry their own given name from their original culture or a native country, and then pick up a local nickname that sounds more familiar to English speakers in America. Same thing's going on in Paul's life, who lives in the Greco-Roman world and in the Roman Empire, but also as somebody raised within Judaism. So anyway, Paul, has this fierce and strong devotion, not just to Judaism, but to the Pharisees' approach to Judaism. And when the followers of Jesus come along, this figure, Saul, ends up not just opposed to Christian teaching, but is rounding up Christians and is actually persecuting them. The book of Acts tells stories about him getting official permission to go bind people, men, women, and children, and bring them back to stand trial, that he's the one holding the coats when Stephen is stoned to death in the book of Acts. So Paul is this number one enemy of the early Christian church, and the risen Jesus gets a hold of him in this dramatic moment on the road to Damascus, as the book of Acts tells us. And Paul sort of gives us his own version of those stories. He doesn't give us a lot of detail, but he does say he's on the way to Damascus, and there a revelation of Christ got a hold of him. Here for Paul is a really important difference. He doesn't see the gospel of Jesus as something that you can teach and master, that you can just take a class on. He says his credentials as an apostle, as a good news bearer, don't come because he studied under the right rabbi or has the right diploma, but because Jesus himself, the risen Jesus, appeared to him, because God revealed the truth of the gospel to him apart from all those other human institutions. Again, we're not at a point in church history where we have seminaries and ordinations and even priests per se. We have this movement that's beginning, and Paul is convinced the risen Jesus appearing to him gives him the authority to bring the good news, that news he received, to anybody and everybody, and that his calling from the very beginning had been to bring it to the outsiders beyond Judaism, to the Gentile world. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Anyway, Paul's point here is his authority doesn't come because he studied under the right people or he spent so many years taking classes, but that the risen Jesus appeared to him, and the risen Jesus gave to him this message about God's gift of grace, about God's way of bringing people into relationship apart from their ability to keep commandments or follow traditions or practice rituals. This is the beginnings of what Paul will call being justified by grace through faith. Here's the critical thing for us to hold on to. Paul's own life story is not one of him working his way, getting ever closer to God or getting closer and closer to Jesus by his sheer willpower or determination or developing his skill, but rather just the opposite. Even when he's dead set opposed to Jesus and his movement, Jesus grabs a hold of him first. Jesus is the one who makes the first move. It's Jesus who appears to him, brings this good news to him, and pulls Paul, turns him around. In other words, at the heart of Paul's own life experience is a love that didn't wait for him to take the first move, but grabbed a hold of him in love, turned him around, and pulled him in close. For Paul, this is what makes the good news the good news. This is what makes the gospel actually gospel. It's not about what we do to make ourselves appealing to God. It's not about us auditioning or trying to show God, look how good I am, you should pick me for your team, God. Or it's not even about us inviting Jesus into our hearts, but about Jesus crashing the party, breaking through the walls we set up, sort of Kool-Aid Man style, crashing into our realities and pulling us into the presence and into the embrace of God. That difference is everything. It's not about us working our way up. It's about a God who comes to where we are, meets us where we are, and who doesn't wait for us to make the first move. That's huge, because to be honest, an awful lot of what is peddled as Christianity, even 21 centuries later, is basically religious self-help that starts with, you got to make the first move. You got to invite Jesus into your heart. You got to pray the right prayer, do the right ritual, do these 5 things, believe these 10 facts. And once you've done those things well enough, then you can ask Jesus into your heart or go to heaven, or however the sales pitch is worded. Paul starts from the exact opposite direction because he lived it. He says, I was pointed away from Jesus. I was literally trying to persecute and destroy the community of Jesus, but Jesus didn't give up on me. He got through to me, reached me, showed me his love, and his getting through to me turned me around. That's the way Paul reads his own life story in the book of Galatians. And even though he doesn't give us all the details of that Damascus Road story that, say, the book of Acts does, the idea is still there in Paul's telling in the letter to the Galatians, that he's dead set turned away from God, and God gets through to him first, that's how grace works. And that the most then we can do, the most that our role in this relationship is that we receive what God gives us as a gift of faith. We trust what God has done. We find ourselves found. We don't audition or grow by our skill to make ourselves worthy, but even when we're completely turned away from God in Christ, God comes through and finds us. That makes all the difference. And that's exactly why, like we said in our first class session, that great line of Robert Farrar Capon's, that grace has to be drunk straight up. No water, no ice, and certainly no ginger ale. The moment you start watering it down with, okay, it's God's love, but also you have to do this and this and this and this and this, you've lost the gospel. And not only have you lost it, Paul's convinced you're turning something life-giving into something poisonous, like adding one extra oxygen from H2O to make it H2O2, and water becomes poisonous hydrogen peroxide. That's what's going on in the first chapter of Galatians. Join us for conversation as we discuss, as we study, as we explore this first chapter of Galatians on this Thursday at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ. And if you can't be with us in person, catch up with these online summaries. Hope you'll join us along the way. Thanks.